Everything changes over the next few days, and I mean everything. What starts tomorrow as an explosive severe weather outbreak in the plains is going to morph into a flash flooding disaster by Sunday morning, then split the entire country in half by next week, with rain drowning one side and dangerous heat baking the other. Baseball-sized hail, 75-mile-an-hour wind gusts, possible. Tornadoes, 6 inches of rain falling overnight, and a fire weather threat out west that could spark the next big wildfire with a single lightning strike. This is not a one-day story. This is a multi-day chain reaction, and it is about to hit more than 60 million people. So let's break down exactly what's coming, hour by hour, because the forecast over just the next few days is about to look completely different from where we are standing right now. Let's start with tomorrow, because this is where the real action begins, and it begins in the plains. We've got an enhanced risk of severe weather setting up across eastern Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska, and this is a high confidence call. If you live anywhere near Goodland or Colby, or if you're planning on driving along Interstate 70 close to the Colorado-Kansas line, you need to have your plans locked in by late afternoon tomorrow. That includes anyone heading out to a ball game or any outdoor event in that region this weekend, because these storms are not going to be polite about their timing. Here's the setup. We've got a low-pressure system deepening just east of the Rockies, and it's dragging moisture northward with dew points climbing into the mid-60s across the high plains. For this part of the country, that is essentially rocket fuel for severe storms. The most recent model runs have actually nudged the dry line a little farther west than we initially expected, which means storms are likely going to fire in the afternoon instead of waiting until evening. Expect storms to begin building over the higher terrain of southeast Wyoming and southwest South Dakota somewhere between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and possibly even a bit earlier than that. Once these storms move off the higher ground and tap into that richer, more humid air at the surface, they are going to explode in intensity almost immediately. We are talking about discrete supercells here, the kind of storms capable of producing hail up to 3 inches in diameter. That is baseball-sized hail, and it is large enough to shatter windshields and devastate early-season crops in a matter of minutes. As these individual storm cells begin merging into a more organized line later Saturday evening, the primary danger shifts toward damaging straight-line winds, with gusts expected to reach 70 to 80 miles per hour. Winds at that speed are strong enough to snap power poles and peel roofing material right off of structures. This is the real deal, and anyone living in or traveling through this region needs to treat it that way. Now, let's talk about the question everyone is going to be asking, and that's tornadoes. Yes, the threat is real, and it's most significant early in the life cycle of these storms, while we still have discrete supercells operating near a surface boundary where directional wind shear is going to be strong with height. I think the tornado threat tomorrow is genuinely elevated, though this is not shaping up to be a widespread outbreak scenario. Instead, expect a couple of isolated pockets where rotation could become strong enough to produce visible, well-structured tornadoes. As the storms move closer to more populated areas and begin merging into that line, the threat profile shifts more toward hail and wind, with the tornado risk becoming secondary. If you live in the path of tomorrow's storms, or if you've got outdoor plans, this is exactly the kind of setup where having a backup alert system on your phone makes a real difference. Especially since these storms are going to continue into the overnight hours. And that overnight continuation is actually where the next chapter of this story begins, because by the time most people wake up on Sunday, that same cluster of storms will have spent the entire night dumping rain over a remarkably consistent corridor, setting the stage for a serious flash flooding threat. The Weather Prediction Center has already issued a level 3 out of 4 moderate risk for flooding across southeastern Nebraska, northeastern Kansas, northwestern Missouri, and a sliver of southwestern Iowa. The reason this corridor is so specifically targeted comes down to a stalled warm front that's going to sit right near the Iowa border. That front is essentially going to function like a railroad track, guiding storm after storm along the exact same path while tapping into an enormous reservoir of moisture overhead. As the broader storm complex slides east-southeast overnight, a continuous stream of warm, humid air at low levels is going to keep feeding into it through Sunday morning, which means the storms keep redeveloping and tracking over the same towns and counties again and again. The latest model data suggests we could see localized rainfall rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour in the most intense cores, though the majority of the affected area will likely see something closer to 1 to 2 inches per hour. Even that lower number is more than enough to overwhelm drainage systems and cause significant problems. Some isolated spots could end up with as much as 6 inches of rain by the time the system clears overnight, and that is more than enough to put water over roadways and stall out vehicles that attempt to drive through. If you take nothing else away from this part of the forecast, remember the phrase, "turn around, don't drown," because flooded roads are deceptively dangerous, and it does not take much water to sweep a car off the road. A flood watch is already in effect along the Interstate 70 corridor, stretching into northern Missouri. So if you live in that zone, keep a close eye on nearby creeks and streams as this event unfolds. Stay prepared, not scared, but definitely stay prepared. Now let's shift attention down to the deep south, because the remnants of Tropical Storm Arthur are simply refusing to let the Gulf Coast catch a break. There's a slight risk for flooding rain stretching all the way from eastern Texas through the Florida Panhandle on Saturday. And the air mass sitting over this region is completely saturated with moisture, which is going to fuel intense, slow-moving downpours. Unfortunately, this is a story this region has already lived through over the past several days. A leftover boundary is going to park itself just north of the coastline, and that's going to allow storms to train repeatedly over the same areas, once again producing rainfall rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour in the heaviest cores. The difference with this round, compared to what we've already seen, is duration and coverage. This is not going to be an isolated pocket event like what we're expecting in the plains. This is shaping up to be a longer duration event, spread across a much larger area. Most locations will likely see somewhere between 1 and 3 inches of additional rain, but there will be pockets that pick up more than 6 inches on top of ground that, in some cases, has already received between 10 and 20 inches of rain over the past several days. With soil this saturated, even a relatively modest 6 inches of new rainfall is enough to trigger instant flash flooding and overwhelm drainage systems. Honestly, even a brief afternoon downpour could be enough to wash out roads that had only just finished draining from the previous day's rain. The remnants of Arthur are now pushing off into the Atlantic, with only a 10% chance of any redevelopment over the coming week, but don't let that low percentage create a false sense of security. The flooding danger on the ground right now is very real, and it's something we'll continue watching closely as this plays out. While all of that is happening in the central and eastern parts of the country, let's swing out west, because conditions there could not be more different, and in some ways more dangerous in their own unique way. We've got a critical fire weather threat taking direct aim at the Four Corners region. Deep daytime mixing, extending up to 15,000 feet, is going to drag down wind gusts of 30 to 40 miles per hour to the surface, and when you combine that with single-digit relative humidity, you've created what is essentially a powder keg environment. Parts of New Mexico and Colorado are going to sit in single-digit humidity for up to 12 consecutive hours, which is more than enough to bake already dry vegetation into an even more combustible state. If you have outdoor festival plans or camping trips planned for this weekend anywhere in this region, please exercise real caution, because a single stray spark has the potential to ignite a fire that spreads rapidly under these conditions. On top of the wind and humidity threat, there's also a dangerous dry lightning setup developing, stretching from northern California into the central Rockies. This means a series of high-base thunderstorms capable of producing lightning strikes while delivering almost no rainfall to the ground. The combination, lightning without meaningful rain, is precisely the recipe that ignites new, fast-moving wildfires. Fuel conditions across this region are currently sitting above the 90th percentile, and in some areas, even the 97th percentile for how readily they can burn. That means anything that does ignite has a significantly higher chance of spreading quickly and aggressively. If you're camping, hiking, or off-roading anywhere in the Sierra or the Rockies this weekend, please understand that a single spark or lightning strike could be the start of the next major wildfire. Now let's fast forward to Sunday, because this is where the entire weather pattern shifts eastward, and the story becomes a 1-2 punch of damaging winds and flash flooding across the mid-Mississippi and Ohio valleys. The Storm Prediction Center already has a slight risk in place, stretching from eastern Oklahoma through Missouri and into central Illinois, an area that includes Springfield and St. Louis. The atmosphere across this region is going to be incredibly moisture-rich for this time of year, with conditions over central Illinois sitting around the 99th percentile for moisture content in late June. If you live in Illinois, you already know how humid this time of year typically feels, but this is going to push well beyond what's considered normal. That large storm complex moving through Saturday night is expected to push into western Missouri during the early morning hours on Sunday, carrying a real possibility of wind gusts reaching 60 miles per hour, particularly in areas north of Interstate 44. Gusts at that speed are more than capable of bringing down large tree limbs and knocking out power right as people are starting their Sunday morning. If you've got outdoor plans, including any sporting events in this region, it would be wise to keep a weather radar app close by, because there's a real chance these storms could interfere with afternoon activities. A lot of people want to know specifically what kind of severe weather to expect on Sunday, and honestly, it's a little too early to commit firmly to a tornado forecast. Right now, this setup is really coming down to a simple question. Is this going to be a wind event or a flooding event? And the answer depends almost entirely on the exact storm track. If the system tracks farther north, closer to Interstate 80, that's going to maximize the wind threat. If it tracks farther south, closer to Interstate 70, that's going to maximize the flooding threat instead. If the outflow boundary from Saturday's storms ends up stalling and aligning with the winds aloft, we could see storms training repeatedly over the same locations, dumping an extraordinary amount of rainfall on areas that have already seen heavy rain. Right now, there's a 50 to 70% chance of totals exceeding 2 inches north of Interstate 70 in Illinois, with localized spots between Bloomington and the Jacksonville area potentially seeing 3 to 4 inches of rain. That kind of repeating heavy rainfall is more than capable of overwhelming creeks and flooding low-lying areas by Sunday afternoon. If the training thunderstorm scenario plays out, that's going to be the headline story of the day. But the wind threat remains very real as well, and we can't completely rule out an isolated tornado risk, especially along that warm frontal boundary. There is a small piece of good news buried in here, though. Once the cold front responsible for all of this finally clears the region, temperatures on Monday are expected to drop back into the 70s, even if the front leaves behind a trail of wind damage and flooding in its wake. So that covers the chaos of the next 48 hours. But remember, everything changes again once we move past this weekend, because the pattern shifts dramatically heading into next week. The country is essentially going to split into two distinctly different weather stories, rain dominating the east and brutal heat building across the west. The Weather Prediction Center has issued a slight risk for flooding on Monday, stretching from Oklahoma into the central Appalachians, as this weekend's frontal boundary begins to stall out across the region. That leftover boundary is going to keep moderate to locally heavy rain in place across the southeast and southern plains right through the middle of next week, meaning the soggy pattern across this region is far from over. Meanwhile, up in the Ohio Valley and the Appalachians, a warm front lifting northward. Sunday night into Monday is expected to wring out another 1 to 2 inches of rain on top of already saturated ground, and that combination could be enough to spark a few additional rounds of stronger storms in that corridor as well. Now flip over to the other half of the country, because conditions out west are about to become almost unrecognizable compared to what's happening in the east. A significant dome of high pressure is building in, and that's going to send temperatures soaring into the triple digits, somewhere between 100 and 110 degrees across the desert southwest. On top of that, a serious heat wave is also building across the Pacific Northwest by Monday into Tuesday, with roughly a 30% chance that Portland reaches the 100-degree mark, while Seattle could potentially crack 90 degrees as well, numbers that are well above what's typical for this region in late June. Looking out even further, toward week 2, the Climate Prediction Center is highlighting a slight risk of extreme heat developing across California's Central Valley, the Southern Plains, and the Florida Peninsula beginning around June 26th. At the same time, there's also a developing week 2 risk for heavy rainfall stretching from the upper and middle Mississippi Valley into the Great Lakes region. So if you've got outdoor plans heading into next weekend, especially anything involving large outdoor festivals or gatherings in that corridor, it would be smart to pack rain gear, because this wet pattern shows real signs of sticking around as these two dramatically different air masses continue battling it out across the country. The simple version of all of this comes down to one easy way to remember it. If you're in the east, keep an umbrella within arm's reach for the foreseeable future. If you're in the west, brace yourself for a punishing and potentially dangerous stretch of extreme heat. But before that heat wave fully takes hold, there's actually a silver lining tucked into this forecast, and it's happening in the Pacific Northwest. If you're looking to dodge the rough weather building elsewhere, this weekend, especially Saturday, is shaping up to be a genuinely beautiful day across the central high plains and the Pacific Northwest. A nice push of onshore air is going to bring crisp, dry conditions to Portland and Seattle, with temperatures comfortably sitting in the mid-70s and 60s right along the coastline. Dew points are expected to drop into the low 50s, and there's essentially a 0% chance of rain in these areas on Saturday. This is going to be the perfect window to get outside, take a hike, or simply open up the windows and air out the house before the more oppressive heat moves in later next week. Keep in mind, the UV index is going to run on the higher side, so it might feel a bit more intense in direct sunlight than expected. But overall, this is shaping up to be a genuinely pleasant afternoon, and one worth taking advantage of before conditions shift again. And that right there is the perfect way to sum up these next several days. Explosive severe weather and possible tornadoes tomorrow in the plains. A serious flash flooding threat developing overnight into Sunday morning across the Central Plains. A dangerous fire weather and dry lightning setup simultaneously unfolding out west. A fresh round of damaging winds and flooding shifting into the Ohio Valley on Sunday. And then, almost as if someone flipped a switch, the entire country splits in half heading into next week, with the east getting buried under repeated rounds of rain, and the west bracing for a brutal and potentially record-challenging heat wave. This is exactly why I keep saying everything changes over the next few days, because what we're dealing with right now barely resembles what we're going to be talking about by the middle of next week. Make sure you're staying weather aware no matter which part of this forecast applies to you. because whether that means watching for hail and wind tomorrow, flooding overnight, fire danger out west, or heat. Building in the days ahead, this entire stretch of weather deserves your full attention. Keep multiple ways to receive alerts close by, especially if you're in any of the higher risk zones we talked about today. And don't hesitate to share this information with anyone you know who might be impacted, because being a few hours ahead of a warning can make all the difference. Let me also walk you through why this kind of rapidly evolving pattern tends to catch people off guard. The plane's setup tomorrow is being driven by a classic combination of ingredients: a deepening low-pressure system, a surge of moisture at the surface, and a dry line positioned just right to trigger new storm development. When all three line up the way they're lining up tomorrow, that's what meteorologists call a high confidency. Severe weather day, meaning the ingredients are clearly in place rather than marginal. That's part of why this forecast has stayed fairly consistent over the last day or two of model runs. Even as small details like timing have nudged slightly earlier. The overnight flooding threat that follows is a textbook example of what's sometimes called a training storm pattern, where individual thunderstorm cells move one after another along the exact same path, like train cars, following the same track. Each storm dumps its rain, moves along, and gets immediately replaced by another storm doing the same thing in the same spot. That's why a relatively modest 1 to 2 inch per hour rate can still produce 6 inches of total rainfall, since it's not one storm sitting in place. It's a continuous parade of storms repeating the same path for hours. This is exactly the kind of setup that catches people off guard overnight, since most people are asleep while the bulk of the rain falls, and by the time they wake up, roads that were fine the night before may already be impassable. The fire weather threat out west deserves a little more attention too, because it's easy to underestimate how quickly conditions can deteriorate there. Combine strong afternoon mixing, low humidity, and gusty winds, and you create what forecasters call critical fire weather conditions, meaning any fire that starts has an unusually high chance of spreading rapidly. Add dry lightning into that mix, strikes without meaningful rainfall reaching the ground, and you have one of the more dangerous ignition scenarios in fire weather, because lightning can spark a fire in remote terrain that may not even be discovered until it has already grown significantly. As we move into Sunday and the focus shifts toward the Ohio Valley and mid-Mississippi Valley, it's worth remembering the exact outcome there is still genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is honest, not a hedge. The difference between a wind-dominant day and a flooding-dominant day often comes down to something as small as 20 or 30 miles of storm track placement, which is exactly why forecasters watch these systems so closely in the day or two leading up to the event. And once we clear this weekend's chaos, the bigger picture heading into next week represents a genuine pattern change, not just more of the same. The atmosphere is essentially reorganizing itself, building a persistent ridge of high pressure over the western half of the country while allowing repeated rounds of moisture to keep targeting the east. This kind of split pattern can lock in for a week or more, which is exactly why the outlook for late June leans so heavily towards sustained heat in the west and a continued wet pattern in the east. If you're trying to plan around any of this, build in flexibility wherever you can. For outdoor plans tomorrow and Saturday in the plains, have an indoor backup ready before storms arrive, not after warnings are issued. For anyone in the flood-prone corridors across Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa, keep a close eye on local creek and river levels, since already saturated soil will keep responding quickly to even modest rainfall. And if you're out west enjoying the outdoors this weekend, take fire restrictions and warnings seriously, because the conditions in place are exactly the kind that let small mistakes turn into much larger emergencies. Thank you all so much for sticking with this forecast from start to finish. I'll be back with more updates as this entire system continues to evolve over the next several days, so make sure you're staying tuned for that. Stay safe out there, stay prepared, and we will see you in the very next update.